Sionigata, Jeff Ganolito, Corntassel, Dagladoa, Shaligi, Iguanasi. So my name is Jeff Corntassel. I'm from Cherokee Nation, and I'm so pleased today to have former chief of the Cherokee Nation, Chad Smith, here today for our conversation. So this is our podcast entitled Frontlines Are Everywhere. And this is a podcast that looks at assertions of Indigenous self-determination across Turtle Island and beyond, as well as our expressions of Indigenous internationalism through our diplomacies, our trade relations, and our ways of being. So welcome, Chad Wado, for coming in today. And I'm just going to read a short bio to start us off, and then I'll have you introduce yourself. So Chad Corntassel Smith, and we'll talk about that in a second, is the principal chief of Cherokee Nation from 1999 to 2011. And he has been a powerful force in building businesses and working towards self-sufficiency of Indigenous nations. He has devoted the majority of his adult life to rebuilding the Cherokee Nation and helping Cherokees learn how to help themselves. When he was principal chief, the Cherokee Nation grew its assets from $150 million to $1.2 billion, increased business profits 100-fold, improved healthcare services from $18 million to $310 million, created 6,000 jobs, and dramatically advanced its education, language, and cultural preservation programs. Chad is a legal scholar and an accomplished public speaker. He earned his JD from the University of Tulsa in 1980 and MBA from UN Las Vegas in 2008. You've had quite a few different jobs, Chad, over the years: ironworker, tax lawyer, assistant district attorney, public defender, attorney general, visiting professor at Dartmouth, principal chief, attorney general, and practicing attorney. And Chad is the author of 3 books. First one I have here is it's Leadership Lessons from the Cherokee Nation, published in 2013, Building One Fire from University of Oklahoma Press in 2010. And then you just published a 3rd book entitled Cherokee Nation Proceed Undaunted, a legal commentary on Cherokee Nation's constitutional history, violations, corruption, and moments of hope for the Cherokee people, which is really a historical and legal commentary about the constitutions of the Cherokee Nation and, as you said earlier, what not to do if you're in leadership positions. So welcome, Chad Wado, for being here. And I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
Well, thank you very much. I think from the introduction you gave me, nobody would hire me because I haven't been able to hold down a job for 2 years at a time. And I do remember you and your family from the Corntassel Cemetery visiting around, the annual events there, just west of Stillwell. So it's good to see you again and to get caught up. There was an Indian guy started a conference, how Indian folks, you give them a microphone, they go on forever. And he says, well, let me say this before I begin to talk. The people paid attention. Let me say this before we talk. Let me apologize on behalf of all good-thinking Americans and Indigenous people from America for the shoddy treatment that the President of the United States dealt with Canada. And I ask for your sympathy and prayers. We haven't seen anything. If the rest of the country would go back to Andrew Jackson's time in Georgia in the 1830s, this is really a glimpse of what we were facing back then. So let me express my heartfelt feelings, because America's always been arm in arm with Canada, and particularly the Indigenous people. We have the same, especially those Upper Plains tribes and the East and West Coast tribes.
Yeah, and I think, you have the Jay Treaty, which the U.S. recognizes. I should knock on wood about that. But yeah, the geopolitical situation has changed so dramatically that I do feel like we're returning to almost like an Andrew Jackson kind of 1830s, states' rights era. It's a bit concerning to say the least. So, Yawado, thank you for being here. And to start, this is kind of a broader question. Indigenous nations across Turtle Island have extensive trade networks. We have forms of activism that cross borders. We travel to other Indigenous nations. We, make treaties with them. What is your sense of this notion of Indigenous internationalism? This is a term that we're developing in this project to really talk about that broad conception of how we engage with each other diplomatically. That doesn't necessarily involve that imaginary line. That doesn't necessarily involve state borders.
I had the opportunity a decade or so ago to go on a cultural exchange to Siberia, to Buryatia. I was in the basement of the hotel. They had a little workout room there. And one of the attendants there didn't speak very good English, but we were talking a little bit. And I told him where I was from, and his Buryats, the indigenous people there, Genghis Khan descendants, big horse people. They were very proud of their horsemanship. So one of those folks was visiting with me in the basement. And he said something that was very powerful. He says, "We're all one. We're all one people." So he recognized his role as an indigenous people. And there's something special about that this is your original home. In many places we go, and Jeff, I'm sure you can accent and support this, is that regardless of the country or the language or even the language or religion, folks who realize that you're indigenous, there's a strong common bond. And so I found it even more peculiar that in the wastelands of Siberia, that there's still that kind of sentiment. I think, with technology changing, trade, commonality, exchange, really a great time to begin to inventory the wisdom we have in just lifestyles. How we approach the world and how we get along. We no longer control, at least the Cherokee Nation no longer controls vast assets, minerals, logistics, land, timber that we had 100 years ago. Where we can learn from each other, other tribes, is how we preserve and actually grow. That thought has been with us for centuries, and we can be a happier and healthier people. I think that's a kind of exchange that I'm hoping for and hoping that my children can buy into.
Beautiful. And I think, years, well, really decades of fighting for global Indigenous rights, with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other documents like that have only strengthened our solidarity across these borders. So absolutely. You've talked a lot about, with me in other conversations, about the late Wilma Mankiller and the inspiration, former principal chief of Cherokees, and, an amazing leader. And also, the late Benny Smith and their impacts on your thinking, on your even ways of approaching governance. Who are some of your biggest influences in terms of motivating you for the work that you do, both as former principal chief, but also in your current work in advocacy?
Well, Wilma was unique. She had a technique or a trait or a characteristic that I've only known one other person who had that, and that was Dave Tippecanoe. He was Comanche in Cherokee, and he came to run our business. They both had this really, and let me just say, Dave Tippecanoe was a world-class CEO. He was head of Citgo until he was nationalized. But they both had this ability to listen. And I've watched people, when Wilma was chief, just berate her to her face, and it was ugly. And if I was there, it just made me want to get up and slap these folks. Would never bother her. Countenance would not change. She just took it. And she was looking past that rage or outburst or lashing out to try to understand what people were saying. More often than not, when they realized he was really trying to hear what they were trying to say, often inartful and many times hostile, they began to calm down, and they actually developed a rapport, and Wilma learned something. And so that was never as good as she or Dave Tippeconic, but it was a lesson that I try to strive for. It's just try to look behind the rage and see what's. Now, Benny, he was a great teacher. Every place he went, he was a teacher. He introduced before too long, he'll say, "This is the Cherokee word for dog," but it really means more than dog. It means like small animals. And he would just go into this teaching lesson at any moment and at any time. And he was just masterful at it, masterful. So the adage I remember from him was to learn from all we observe, to learn from all we observe. And the sort of the metaphor is like you get up in the morning and the sun rises and the sun casts shadows. Well, things look a particular way. Then as the sun rises in the sky, the shadows change, so that object, with its new shadows, looks different. Exposes a different side, a different lighting, different hue, a different color. And it keeps going across the sky to noon and late afternoon and dusk. So you get a 180-degree view of that object over a period of time. It changes how you look at it. You learn from all you observe. So the metaphor actually is not only the course of a day, it could be the course of a year, even the course of a lifetime. When you're young, you see the world differently. When you're middle-aged, you see it differently. When you're older, you see it differently. So his admonition to learn from all I observe, really powerful. And then his brother, William Smith, is just a very powerful, quiet leader. And if you wanted to see somebody held in high esteem, it was really a public servant. You know, William was one of those. He led the Stoke Stomp Grounds. So there's other folks. I mean, even in American popular culture, when we learn from all we observe, you have to grab them and pull them in. Like one of my favorite TV shows is Ted Lasso. His name was, it can never be wrong if you're standing up for what is right. You know? And there's just people like that. You know, I know it's scripted. I come across those people every day. My brother Shane has written a script, and we're trying to get it produced, but it's called The Fire Keepers. The idea of the fire keepers, if you go to the stomp grounds, there's several folks that are charged with keeping that fire going during the stomp dance or reviving it in between. And their job is to keep that spirit alive. And so the theme of his script is that through the Trail of Tears, through horrific circumstances, there were people before and during and afterward that were these fire keepers that kept the spirit of humanity alive. So I think I go back to Wilma and to Dave Tippeconic and to William Smith and to Benny Smith and lots of popular folks to say, you know, we've got a lot of things we can learn and depend upon and help us through tough times. And each one of those might be called a fire keeper.
Yeah, I would know for that. And I even think of one of Benny's phrases, Cherokee is for everyone. And I never quite understood when he first said that. I thought, no, it's not for everyone. It's for Cherokees. And I realized he's talking about all of these philosophies, all of these teachings. They're meant to be shared, and they're meant to be shared with others so that they can benefit and live healthy lives. And so I thought he was always so generous with his time. And I didn't have the privilege of knowing Wilma Mankiller, so it's great to hear you speak about some of the leadership qualities she embodied. What for that? So early on in, well, can I ask you, it's kind of off the list of questions that I've prepared, because I think people will be interested. The McGirt decision, since I've got you on the line, that was seen as kind of a landmark decision. And really, as I see it, I'm not a legal scholar, so I wanted to get your sense of this. But as I see it, it recognized the original reservation, which was supposed to be in place, the reservation land. And it also means that it recognizes the jurisdictional authority for some criminal cases. What are your thoughts about McGirt, now that it's, it's been several years since it was originally coming down from the Supreme Court. What are some of your thoughts about the legacy maybe of that case, or is it still to be decided or still in progress?
Well, McGirt was just shocking to Oklahoma that these Indians had territory within the state.
Yeah.
We would always say, why do you guys want to put a state around our territories? And it pushed them to a place where they could not avoid it, that these treaties, histories, are real. And these boundaries still existed. Now when you do it after you've established these boundaries, well, legally, you have different tiers of jurisdiction, some broad, some narrow, some uncharted, many of them that could be negotiated. So McGirt was really about criminal. And there's 1894 case, Taunton versus Mays. It basically said tribes are entitled to enforce their own criminal law, even if it violates the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was a case about the number of grand juries for a criminal prosecution. So it shouldn't be shocking to Oklahomans or the rest of the country. The tribes could control the behavior, particularly the criminal behavior of their members and or other tribal members within their boundaries. It is fairly a restricted, very narrow holding.
Yeah.
The big one was these boundaries still exist, and you can go down to Cherokee Nation to the archives, and there's a sheepskin, about so big as the metes and bounds description, the fee patent that measures from post to post and line to line that outlines Cherokee Nation. Real.
Yeah.
Now, what do you do with the various tiers of jurisdiction? You got taxing, Indian child welfare, regulatory, and sometimes the tribes can use that to their benefit. Sometimes they could work with the state, make it mutually beneficial. And sometimes the tribes and states are just going to have to say we can't agree, and we'll have to let somebody else arbitrate. For example, this idea about jurisdiction. There's a case in 1991, which civil rights case went to the federal circuit court, and the court found that Russian restricted land was outside the state. All McGirt did was say the entire territory is beyond the state's reach for criminal prosecution. So in 1991, I was a lawyer for the tribe, and there was all this frantic behavior. Well, we don't know what land is Indian country. in the middle of the night, there's a shooting or a domestic assault or a kidnapping. And then the local police, they said, well, anything that looks like an Indian house, we're not going to go. We're not going to respond. Well, so what's an Indian house? 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath brick house. Every place. Everyone that looked sort of like that, whether it was on trusted restricted land, local guys wouldn't go. So the remedy was very simple because they've been doing it all in the Southwest for decades, is to cross-deputize. The Cherokee Nation Marshal, he goes out there, catches the bad guy, whether it's in state or tribal jurisdiction. County sheriff, he goes out there, catches the bad guy if it's trust or restricted land or state jurisdiction, because they've got the authority of either sovereign. So they arrest them, then take them to jail. Then the lawyers figure out which court. And that's pretty much where we should be today. Unfortunately, we haven't got that way with McGirt. You could almost cross-deputize court to do the same thing. Get a DUI in Tulsa. Show up, it's your first one. The standard is you get a deferred sentence at $5,000 fine and community service. I'm not being trite about it. That's pretty much a standard plea bargain in Oklahoma. Well, you could show up and say, Judge, I want my trial. I'm in Indian country. The judge says, okay, head on down to Tahlequah, they'll give you the trial. Or he could say, if you don't want to go through that, if you know you're dead to right, if you want to let the local DA talk to you about a deal, you can stay in this court. And they would be exercising the jurisdiction of either the tribe or the state. So there's ways out of this.
Yeah.
We had administrations that wanted to get along.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that. Thanks for talking to us about the kind of ramifications of this case. One of the teachings you shared with me a lot in the writings, and I remember even our discussion around the Cherokee history course, is that when we're faced with adversity as Cherokees, we survive, adapt, prosper, and excel. And we kind of go through those 4 stages over and over again throughout our time as Cherokee Nation. And it really expresses the resilience of our nation. But I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Did you develop these kinds of approaches, by looking at historical reactions of Cherokee Nation to tragedy, to harm, or how does that land with you today? Like, what does that mean? Now that we're in a different time period, what does that look like?
Well, one man killer in the early 90s, when I was working for as a lawyer, they're approaching us and says, for our management to make good decisions, they need to know where you come from. The simplest adage. How do you know where you're going if you don't know where you come from? So could I put on a history class? And so I had a couple of staff folks that helped me. They had a big old box, and we went and grabbed everything we could, had Cherokee on it. Treaties, treatises, maps, law review articles, everything. We threw it in that box. Then we started separating it. And it broke down into 22 chapters. And then we started teaching. We compiled a book. It was 600 pages. We began to teach it as Pat Ragsdale was helping. First one, then Dr. Julia Coates was brought on. She taught it to every one of her employees. And it was really funny because the groundskeepers, the plumbers, custodians, they would show up when I was in office. We made it highly recommended at first, and then we made it mandatory. And they would show up the first day, and they'd just be complaining. I never liked high school. I never liked history. I didn't like any of this. I got better things to do. And about it was a five straight days. You're on the top, they're getting paid. But day 3, you could see the complexion of the class completely changed. And it was almost shock. And after the end of the class, you could watch its cloud rise. We finally come to suggest that it was historic grief. When this cloud rose, that they saw what their ancestors went through, there's no excuses anymore for us to proceed. And as we taught this class over and over, it became very apparent to me that we faced adversity, survived, adapted, prospered, excelled. And that was a legacy that our history bore out. And just as a footnote, if I can leave of all the things I would like to say, but people won't remember. This is what I'd like people to leave with. I just wrote this book called Cherokee Nation Proceed Undaunted. It's a long book. It's 700 pages. Why would anybody ever read it? Right? Don't go from cover to cover, set it down, find a chapter that interests you, sort of pick at it. Got 1,500 footnotes. And I started it because I was irritated at our court system making bad decisions. Went to a university press and they said, well, if you do history of the constitutions, you can put into context better the violations. And all right, so I spent some time, wrote about all of our constitutions in 1827. And I was still a bit pessimistic. There was another adage that I used when I talked to communities. And I would say, if we don't make wise decisions, on page 40, footnote 3 of a history book, it'll read, there once was a great Cherokee Nation, but it is no more. And so that was the title of the book. Then my son, I was discussing with him, he's going to put a website up for me. He says, that's awful pessimistic. Nobody will want to read that. He was right.
Yeah.
Then 3 or 4 weeks before I published it with Amazon, and you just can go to Amazon. I priced it so to get under a $30 mark so that everybody. My daughter posted on Facebook this post about her working in this shop, and when things would bring routine, she'd put her headphones in and listen to stop dance music. And it made her whole disposition, gave her happiness and hope and said, and I got to that, and I told myself, shame on you, Chad. Like, you got all these people out there just wanting some hope that we're going to proceed undaunted. And that was another cliche I often used. So that's the name of the book now, because there is that hope. We've gone through stories and episodes, horrific. The Trail of Tears was one of the worst. The allotment is probably the worst by far.
Yes.
We're going through a kleptocracy, which mirrors the United States. But we shouldn't lose heart. We shouldn't lose faith. To proceed undaunted.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, and I think that Cherokee history course was mobile, right? So it went to lots of the Cherokee communities outside of the nation. And I almost think it should have been required for everyone in the state of Oklahoma. I know that would be hard to implement, but it was such a valuable. I was in on the pilot. I think Rita Coolidge was in there, and a few other folks. And it's just such a valuable course. It's really about jogging memories, reminding people this is the leadership, this is our legacy. And I just thought it was such an effective way of bringing people into our nation, whether they're citizens or not, to see the context and to see the leadership and to see the resilience.
Julia Coates, she's brought on, that's what she did full time.
Yeah.
She would go to rural or urban communities and all day Saturday and Sunday, 2 weekends. And it's the only class that I've ever seen that the number of students increased over the course of the class rather than decreased. The first one, they would tell their kids or aunts or uncles or folks, and then the next class would be great bigger, and the next class would be bigger than those 2 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really, I think you and Julia had a really effective model, because you brought in yourselves as instructors, but also you had elders or knowledge holders. So the one we had the late Hastings Shade, and then also Benny Smith. And yeah, their storytelling, they're telling us amazing things to complement this body of work and to really highlight how we're all connected to this. So this next, we'll shift gears a little bit to sending a delegate to Congress. And so we have that right under the 1785 treaty. I think it's Article 12, Treaty of Hopewell, that we can, they shall have the right to send a deputy of their choice whenever they see fit to Congress. And then, of course, the one that's invoked most is Article 7 of the 1835 Treaty of Achota. Basically states that Cherokee Nation shall be entitled to a delegate in the House of Representatives of the United States whenever Congress shall make provision for the same. So Principal Chief Chuck Hoskin Jr. in 2019 nominated Kimberly Teehee to serve as the Cherokee Nation's first delegate to Congress. Kimberly is yet to be seated in Congress, and it's given the current political climate, it's hard to know where this will go. And what are your thoughts, I guess, about really enforcing our treaties, right? Making them living documents rather than things that are often relegated to the past. And I guess, what are your thoughts about this treaty provision, which is really about internationalism, right? We've got our own diplomacy, we've got our own delegates. And so I was just wondering what your thoughts were about, how do we implement these kinds of treaty provisions? And given all the backlash, given all of the potential hoops to jump through, and assert our self-determining authority.
Well, we had a 1999 Constitution Convention, and I was one of the 88 delegates, and I introduced the provision to have embedded in our Constitution the right to a delegate to Congress. And when I took office, it was a priority. We had law review articles. We had a strategy, how to get that person seated. What you'll find in the law, and this is should be applied to other situations too, but a treaty right is a political right that is unenforceable by the courts. You can't take Spain in the United States court over some provision. Take the Cherokee Nation to court to abide by a provision of a treaty. Cherokee Nation can't take the federal government to court with them violating the Constitution by a treaty right. The only thing you can do is if there's you sort of bootstrap on the U.S. Constitution prohibition of taking property without just compensation. So the treaty rights, like the lands that were taken and said that they weren't accounted for, you can get into court sometimes under the takings clause. But get to enforce the treaty. Okay, get the feds to say, yeah, right there it is, big as Dallas, and send a delegate to Congress and sit right beside Guam and Puerto Rico and other places. It really was, and some people can fault Hoskins for nominating Kimberly to be the delegate because it was premature. What we're not saying, if it's not premature, time wasn't right, because the only thing will get you to get Congress to seat a delegate is that the prevailing party will have to have a reason to seat the person. The delegate can't vote in the open floor on general legislation. They can vote in committee. They can introduce legislation. They certainly can be a voice for not only the Cherokee Nation, but Indigenous. So there's never been the time the prevailing party has confidence that the delegate to Congress would benefit them. I mean, it's just all politics.
Right.
Politics. Then even in Indian country, you had people resisting it, saying, well, Cherokee's got a delegate to Congress. How come we don't?
Well, yeah, right.
And even with the UKB that didn't exist when these treaties were done, they'll say, well, give Cherokees a delegate. We deserve one. Well, I mean, that kind of nonsense. And when you have that kind of nonsense, your best shot in front of Congress is even wings greater. So,
yeah.
So the real question is, when will Congress have the integrity to live up to its word?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that really straightforward talk about it too, because I hear people dance around it, but this is just a very straightforward approach. And I think at best, even if Congress, let's say, had summoned up the integrity, I don't know where they had summoned it at this point, but summoned up the integrity to seat a Cherokee delegate, we would basically be an observer, right? Primarily an observer status.
Just like Puerto Rico or Guam. I mean,
yeah.
You can participate every place except on the. It's a very valuable, powerful.
Yeah, it's a voice, but yeah, 1-0 for that. I'm taking you back in time here. 2005, I interviewed you for a book called Forced Federalism. At that time, I was really critical of the ways that I thought, the federal government was offloading responsibilities to state governments, and making them political. So, governors suddenly have this clout or assuming authority over things like gaming, child protection, hunting and fishing, things like that. And we could talk about whether that's come to fruition or not. But we talked at the time about, that's kind of negotiation or litigation, and in your worst case scenario, legislation, right? Legislation was kind of like that. And I guess you've thrown in a fourth, mediation. Given some of the animosities of the current Governor Stitt, who's been made no bones, Governor Stitt of Oklahoma has made no bones about being against the sovereignty of Cherokee Nation, and I think other indigenous nations, other tribes. What does this picture look like for you today? And I'm kind of asking you to time travel a bit. What does it look like for you today? And thinking ahead, you do a great job in the leadership book about we need to have 100-year plan. What does the next 100 years look like? And I'm kind of asking you the impossible here, but what does this feel like today that maybe is different from what we talked about in 2005? And then, how should we respond to it? Or, how should we think beyond the immediate to maybe 100 years from now?
Pat Ragsdale told me, says, last year we had a chance to review our Constitution because it provides for that the question should be posed every 20 years if people want to have a constitutional convention to review it. And he said, well, it doesn't matter if you don't follow your own Constitution. It doesn't matter what the Constitution says. So the Cherokee Nation is at a really vulnerable point, right? Because move forward, you have to have confidence in the institution and your leaders. And so, for example, Cherokee Supreme Court rewrote a section of the Constitution. They didn't interpret it. They just said the 2007 constitutional amendment passed by 77% of the people was no longer the law. We're just going to take it out of the Constitution. We're going to ban the words "of blood" forever from all of our laws. I mean, that is bizarre. A branch of government would rewrite the Constitution. Wasn't interpreting whether it applied here or applied there. He just flat out said, no. President administration, in a breach of the separation of powers, created a citizens committee to give the elected officials raise, which was about 200% overnight.
Holy smokes.
Say, oh, we didn't give ourselves that raise. This committee did. Well, that's a confession of the separation of power. The only one who can spend $1 of the nation's money is a council by a law in open forum, on the record and such. They tried to skirt around it and have this committee take responsibility and take the heat for them not saying we deserve a raise. And of course, they made it even worse. To build upon a political base, this committee gave 42 previous councilmen $40,000 lump sum payment. For what? They've been out of office. And what you can surmise is that's how they could buy or ensure that these 42 elected officials would bring along their constituents, their former constituents, into election. They get a good chunk. And then to make it worse, 2 years later, they affirm it and say, we're going to give you a 20% bonus so you can pay the taxes on it. And
wow.
It just goes, it's wrong.
Yeah.
And here's the thing is that, as we all know, and this goes back to the allotment. One of my great heroes, W.A. Duncan, sometimes he wrote under his pen name Tukwasti. And he was complaining about the council, the Cherokee officials, not standing up against allotment. Very articulate, very eloquent, very powerful. And basically says, councilmen won't do their job. It's nobody's fault except our own. So the message here is we must be engaged. And we don't know what the future will be 5, 10, 100 years from now, unless every one of our people are informed and engaged. Otherwise, we're floating aimlessly on a great ocean, may never be seen.
We could end up mimicking some of the worst aspects of government in the dominant U.S. system. There's a real danger there. And I heard the late Vine Deloria Jr. used to say, when the people lead, the leaders will follow. And I think there's something to that. People have to pay attention. They have to promote accountability from leadership, or we're going to have the same old thing, right? We're going to have the status quo. We're not going to have that 100-year future that looks as rosy until we really we're asking youth to invest themselves in this system. They have to be motivated. They have to trust it. Yeah.
This is funny. I talk about popular culture. Batman in the movie The Dark Knight Rises, I think that's the name of it. But the theme of it was that Batman got tired of saving the city. And every time he'd save it, then somebody'd be bitching and complaining and such. Finally says, forget it, I'm retiring. Well, the bad guys bring a nuclear bomb, put it in the middle of the city, it's an island, tell the police, the mayor, anybody crosses those bridges, this bomb goes off. So it's isolated. And then that gives a license to all the thugs to take over the government. And it's just absolute chaos. You know, there's good people, there's good police folks. They're driven underground. That man wouldn't. No, not going to do it. And then finally, when people started taking the government back for themselves, taking responsibility, ousting the crooks, he'd finally come back and say, I'll help you. And that's really where we're at. We can't ask anybody else to save us. We have to be part of this.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, no, for that. And a good Batman reference, too. So I appreciate that. One of the things you said in our 2005 interview is that water would be a future source of conflict. And I think that's definitely taking place in different ways. What are some, thinking about some of the ways that we're challenged on a daily basis as Cherokee people, the ways that policies are imposed on us. What do the front lines look like for you? The front lines of liberation or front lines of freedom, maybe. What did those front lines look like for you?
Whatever we can do to build healthy and happy families, and that includes removing some of the epidemics we're faced with, the drugs, alcoholism, even the things that drive folks to consider suicide, basically mental health. And much of mental health, we have tools of in our basic culture. And I'm not talking about the visual things that people want to rely upon, those deep values that teach us to be better people. And Benny Smith, he had 22 words in Cherokee that define the relationship. And one of them is to hold the others sacred. Be stingy with the existence of others. And that's just not being a good neighbor. That's being, you're my brother, and I'm going to take care of you regardless.
Yeah.
A lot of that has been lost. I mean, how many Cherokees know about it or even practice it? So, and how would that affect mental health or alcoholism or drug abuse, creating happy and healthy families? To me, that's really a place that Horizon really needs to be, where that front line needs to be driven.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to remember and act on our notion of Gadugi, right? This notion that we're not alone in life. We are not going to struggle alone. We're going to act together. And I think you're right. We've lost, in some cases, our ability to think like a community, and we start thinking like individuals. And that to me is something that really hopefully motivates youth to return to our teachings. And it's all there. It's all in our teachings. It's all in those 22 relationships that Benny laid out. It's in it's in your writing. It's all there. It's all there for people to pick up. One of the things you stressed in the Cherokee Leadership Lessons book is, and I quote, planting seed corn for our children's future. And I really like that metaphor, right? Because we can request seeds from the nation and plant, but the idea is to replenish that, right? And we need to replenish the seeds. It needs to go back into that seed bank and for future generations. And so this is a question that can encompass the past, present, and future. What does Cherokee freedom, or even that notion of, getting beyond prospering to excelling, what does excelling look like for you? What does that look like in this amazing, space in the future, or even in our past where we've excelled?
I would suggest that, let me just say it this way. When I took office, I was trying to figure out what the purpose of the nation was. And I actually assembled different groups, assembled 2 groups of Cherokee speakers, some other folks, and I said, let us understand, what should the Cherokee Nation be? What should it become? And it was 2 years. We went back and forth, and we had these mission statements that were 25 words long, and nobody could remember. Finally, it was just like this great epiphany on the road to Damascus. There it was. We should become a happy and healthy people. Everything that tribe as a government should do is align to become a happy and healthy people. For law enforcement should be community-based rather than getting worn-out tanks from the federal government on surplus, or schools, or medical, or everything we should do, be aligned to become a happy and healthy people. That's what I see. And that's really what William Redbird Smith said back in the 1917, where he said, we're endowed with these characteristics, but we should not be overlooking our mission on earth and to share mankind. We can learn to be happy and healthy and share it with all of our kinsmen and all of our neighbors. And That's it.
We just have to align ourselves with those principles, those basic values. Yeah, just two more questions, really. What are some of the current things that we should be, and I think, Proceed Undaunted kind of highlights this a little bit, but what are some current things we should be paying attention to that aren't necessarily covered in the regular news cycle? What are some things that you think have been dropped or, we should really be talking more about that's not being discussed?
Well, I think a lot of the things we need to pay attention to will not be in the news cycles, and probably appropriately so. But still trying to regrow our language, understand the concepts behind the language and Redbird Smith had talked about a kindly man not be a good neighbor unless he has a surplus. So a charity from the home, from the community, that it also helps build that sense of we belong to each other. Very helpful.
Yeah.
And those are things that won't make a news cycle, and they probably shouldn't. It's just person by person and family by family and community by community.
It doesn't need to be publicized. It needs to just be done. Enacted. And then finally, is there anything we didn't discuss that you'd like to talk about? We covered a broad range of things, but so lots of things we could have talked about. What are anything that we left out?
I think, for Indigenous people, Indian folks, when they see other tribes and learn from them, there's this sense of commonality, a sense that we're not by ourselves. There's a sense we have a lot to share and a lot to learn. In studying our history, and this is one of the unique things about tribes, it's still relatively small, that they know these people that's in the history book. They know stories of it. In fact, the first part of this book talks about thanking the artists, scholars, storytellers, and filmmakers, keeping these stories alive. So we can not forget. And the nice thing about Indian folks is that, I remember John Ross, what he did during the Civil War. Yeah, I remember Stan Wadey doing whatever. I remember Liza Butenot. I remember what such and such did during the Civil War, during the allotment period, during the Depression. So history actually ties us to an entire body of people. And it also creates a duty for us, descendants are going to remember what we've done, what we didn't do.
You've ridden on the Remember the Removal bike ride, right? That powerful journey. And that's such a powerful way to commemorate such a tragic time in our history. And so Wado for that, and Wado for all of your good work. Cherokee Nation Proceed Undaunted, a commentary on Cherokee Nation's history, corruption, and hope, and an emphasis on hope, courtesy of your children or your son and daughter. So Wado, thank you, Chad. And we didn't mention, so it's Chad Corntassel Smith. We're not related. So that, do you want to tell the origin of your name?
My grandmother gave us Cherokee names, 10, 12 years after we were born. And mine was Ujiz. I got a brother's Redbird, Toju, Tanovans, and Mocklet. It's just a given name.
And powerful one at that.
It's a good one.
Yeah. Benny used to say Ujijita, the flowering of the corn. I think that's such a powerful way to talk about it. So, Wado, thank you.
Wado, go on.
Wado, go on.